Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Common Interest. I'm Mitch Hayes.
And I'm Greg.
And on today's episode, we're going to be continuing our series on structural integrity. Today we're going to be focused on reserve and reserve studies that are a component of the bill and applies to every association, whereas the structural integrity issues that we talked about last time, the engineering part of it, only applied to some certain situations, right, Greg?
Yep. So the first part that we talked about was just the concrete, structural steel, brick high-rises that you typically see, whereas the reserve component applies to every community association, co-op, HOA, condo association in New Jersey, whose common elements, the value of that is greater than $25,000. So just about all.
Right, so a little bit of an exception, but the general rule is it applies.
Right.
So why don't we talk about, from the beginning now, what is the reserve?
Yeah, so for people that don't know, very agree in this, reserves are simply the savings account for the association. It's money set aside for repairs down the road that you're going to have happen, right? You're not going to replace your roofs every year, you're not going to replace your windows every year, or your decks, or your streets, or your sidewalks, but you certainly need to set aside money in the future for your community to make sure that those areas are funded when the time comes and the useful life comes to zero and you have to start making those repairs or replacements.
Right, so just like you or I, we set aside a cushion, hopefully, for our expenses and what we need to do. The association has to do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the new law require?
So there's a lot of stuff in this new law, and we're going to break it down into more specifics, but just in a general sense, it requires a reserve study every 5 years. If you haven't had a reserve study done in the past 5 years, you're going to have 1 year to do a reserve study. If you're a new association that just had their transition, so just the turnover of the board from the developer to the unit owner control, you're going to have 2 years to get your reserve study done. And you'll typically do that anyway through the transition process, but now it's statutorily required to go ahead and do that. So once you get your reserve study, you're going to have to make sure that your reserves are adequately funded.
So two things you just mentioned, okay, is a reserve study as well as adequate funding. So why don't you break down both those terms?
Yeah, so adequate funding is something we've been talking about for a long time in the industry, and nobody really knew what it meant, and there's really still no specific definition. Engineering firms will provide different levels of funding, right? You have baseline, you have threshold funding, you have fully funded reserves. All that the statute requires is that there's adequate funding. So really that's left up to the association. The best practices typically will say you need to go through your threshold level of funding to make sure that you have some cushion and some wiggle room in case you do need to borrow from the reserves for some type of a catastrophic loss or some common element deteriorates prematurely. You want to make sure you have funding there, and that's going to be important.
And what about reserve study though? What does that mean?
Yeah. So the reserve study is pretty straightforward. It's where you basically will hire an engineer to come through your community and they'll take a look at all the common elements. And what they're going to look for is a couple of things. They're going to look at your reserve balance, right? They're going to look at the reserve income and expenditures coming in and out of the reserves. They're going to look at the conditions of the building and make sure that whatever the conditions of the building have a certain amount fixed to it that will require to be replaced. So in 20 years, if you have to get your roof replaced again, they're going to put an actual estimate down for how much that'll cost in 20 years and try to project out. That way you are building up your reserves within that time frame to make sure 20 years comes, you have funding. So now this new law really actually explicitly states what's required in the reserve study, which is great because there's going to be this level of uniformity now between all engineering firms and reserve study specialists that actually know what they need to include. So everybody understands what you have now and what it's going to cost later on to fund. The other component to this, I think that's a little understated, that's going to be important, that ties into the structural integrity part, is the cost of the preventive maintenance that are identified by the engineer in the structural integrity inspection. So that's another caveat here that's going to be important, and I think we'll work through with the engineering firms to make sure that there is a preventive maintenance plan in place, which is something way too many communities have not had.
So now we've talked about reserve studies, we've talked about what adequate funding is. Now, in terms of the bill and its impact on associations, can you give us a kind of high-level overview? We could go in depth for, I'm sure, hours, and we will go in on multiple episodes, but high level, how's it impacting the associations?
Yes. So right off the bat, the first question we're going to get is, when do we have to do the reserve study, and what does it mean for us? And really the answer is, well, it depends how well you've been funding your reserves. If you haven't been funding your reserves, you're going to have to catch up, and you're going to have to find ways to catch up. And there are certain time periods that we'll get into later episodes. You'll have 2 years or 10 years to catch up, depending on the level of inadequacy of your reserves, right? So you'll have that time period where you need to catch up. And really, it means that your association, as a board, you are compelled and mandated to do these things. So you don't have a choice anymore. You used to, for political reasons, to want to get reelected as a board member. Maybe you didn't want to increase maintenance fees because you didn't feel like it was the popular decision. Well, this takes that out of your scope, and now you are required to adequately fund it. So it's really for the long-term health of your community, and I think it's an important bill.
I think everything we've talked about today is important. Everything we talked about yesterday on our last episode with the structural integrity and the engineering aspects are important, and I think we're going to continue to talk about them as we move forward through this bill, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So stay tuned for our next episodes. Follow us on our social media channels, and we'll see you next time.